The handcuffs clicked shut at pump number 4 of Buckhorn Gas and Feed at 7:52 on a Tuesday morning, and the sound carried across the lot, the way sounds carry in flat West Texas. Country clean and hard and further than it should, swallowed eventually by the dry air and the distant whine of an 18-wheeler on Route 9 that didn't slow down and didn't look over. Commander Marcus Webb's cheek pressed against the hood of a silver rental car. The metal was already hot from the morning sun. He did not make a sound. Not because he had no options. He had counted 4 of them in the first 2 seconds after the deputy's hand went to his holster, but because the man who taught him everything he knew about restraint was lying in a box in Oak Haven, and Marcus Webb was going to that funeral clean as an officer with his honor intact, regardless of what it cost him to get there. The uniform told its story to anyone who knew how to read it. Navy dress blues, pressed the night before with the same care he'd give a pre-mission equipment check. The gold trident of the SEALs above his heart. And just below it, a ribbon that most people in Harlan County, Texas, had never seen in person. The pale blue field, the white stars, the constellation of a life spent in service to something larger than itself. Deputy Colt Briggs stood behind him with one hand on the handcuffs he'd fastened deliberately tight and the other hooked into his belt, and the smirk on his face was the smirk of a man who has just won something, though he couldn't have said precisely what. He thought he was arresting a fraud. He had no idea he had just started a clock, that somewhere in a concrete box in the back of his own station, the man he'd arrested was already making the only phone call that mattered. That before the morning was over, the sound of rotor blades would rattle the windows of the Harlan County Sheriff's Department, and the people of this town would line the sidewalk with their phones raised, watching the men who ran their lives get walked out in chains into the flat Texas sun. 58 years in a military prison was the merciful option. Harlan County, West Texas, had the particular atmosphere of a place that used to be something and had spent 30 years in the slow, quiet business of forgetting it. The main street had 4 businesses still open and 6 with papered windows, their interiors visible through cracked glass, sun-bleached and patient. The water tower at the edge of town still bore the county name in letters that had been fading since the Clinton administration. 2 stoplights. The second one had been blinking yellow since a March thunderstorm that nobody had prioritized fixing. Buckhorn Gas and Feed sat at the junction of State Route 9 and the county road that ran south toward the border 40 miles from the nearest competitor, which made it indispensable and made its owner beholden to anyone with the inclination to make his life difficult. The pumps were old. The canopy overhead had a section of sheet metal that rattled in any wind above 15 miles an hour. The cooler inside stocked beer alongside motor oil and phone chargers with the cheerful pragmatism of a place that understood what its customers actually needed. Marcus had pulled in just after 7:30, the rental running low after 4 hours of flat highway from San Antonio, the landscape shifting from scrubland to harder, drier scrubland without variation. He'd fueled up in quiet, watching the numbers tick, the morning already thick with heat. He almost didn't notice the tanker truck. It was parked at the far edge of the lot, engine off, no driver visible anywhere near it, and the detail his brain quietly flagged without making a fuss about was the license plates muddy and partially obscured the state registration sticker sitting in the wrong position for a Texas commercial vehicle. Small thing. The kind of thing most people don't catch. Marcus logged it and looked back at the pump. Colt Briggs had been 19 years old when the Army recruiting sergeant in Midland told him with genuine apology that the heart murmur he hadn't known about was a disqualifying condition, that there were other ways to serve, that it wasn't a reflection of his character or his potential, that Briggs had stopped listening somewhere around disqualifying. He'd driven back to Harlan County that afternoon in silence. And somewhere on that empty highway something shifted in him, not all at once, not dramatically, but the way a bone shifts when it doesn't heal quite right. so that years later the ache is constant and the person carrying it has stopped remembering what it felt like before. The military had looked at Colt Briggs and found him insufficient. That was the truth he lived with, and the way he chose to live with it was to make absolutely certain that no one within the reach of his badge ever felt sufficient either. 6 months after the rejection, his father got him on with the Harlan County Sheriff's Department. Third generation. The grandfather's badge was framed above the fireplace at the family house on Caldwell Road, and Colt had grown up understanding that the badge was not a career, but an identity. The thing that answered the question of who you were when nothing else did. 12 years on the force. Never formally disciplined, not because the reasons hadn't existed, but because Sheriff Dale Munford had never allowed a reason to become a record. The town had a name for what happened when Briggs decided someone was a problem. They called it the exit interview. You either left quietly or you found yourself in cell 3 with charges that somehow always stuck. Either way, the problem was solved, and Munford's operation continued without friction. The men in uniform were the ones Briggs hated with a specificity he'd never examined closely enough to understand. He knew only that when he saw dress blues or combat fatigues, something moved through him that was hot and quiet and needed somewhere to go. He'd have called it contempt if pressed. What it actually was much simpler and much sadder. It was envy wearing contempt's clothes. Dale Munford was 56 years old and had been the most powerful man in Harlan County for so long that the distinction between what the county needed and what he wanted had ceased to exist in any practical sense. He'd been a running back in high school, 2 district championships, his name still on the trophy case in the gymnasium, and 3 decades later he still moved through rooms with the unconscious expectation that spaces would make themselves available to him. The county was dying economically, had been for 20 years. The oil money was gone, the young people were leaving the tax base hollowing out with the slow, inevitable thoroughness of something structural giving way. Munford's response had been neither grief nor revitalization. It had been adaptation. Harlan County sat on a back road corridor 40 miles north of the border, the kind of route that didn't appear on federal surveillance maps as significant, which made it to the right business partners extremely valuable. Munford had those partners. He'd had them for 3 years. Buckhorn Gas and Feed, which he quietly co-owned through a shell company registered in a neighboring county, was where the arrangement was serviced. Briggs was his enforcer, his eyes, and the thing that made the arrangement sustainable. Munford was the brain and the money, and the reason none of it had come apart. Until a man in dress blues stopped for gas on the wrong morning. Marcus Webb had a way of standing that people noticed without being able to name a quality of stillness that read not as passivity, but as something more like readiness. The posture of a man who has been in enough situations where the difference between living and not living came down to the quality of his attention, and who had learned that the body holding itself quietly is the body that moves first when it has to. He was 44 years old and looked at the way a well-maintained aircraft looks its age, every hour of service visible, nothing worn past its tolerance. The dress blues had been pressed the night before at a San Antonio hotel iron with the same deliberate care he'd give a pre-mission check because the uniform was not clothing to Marcus Webb. It was a covenant, a promise made visible. He honored it the way he honored everything that mattered to him, which was completely and without negotiation. The ribbon rack told a story in compressed language to anyone fluent in it. Silver Star, Bronze Star, with Valor Purple Heart Navy Cross, and at the top, the pale blue field with its white stars, the one that civilians sometimes recognized on sight, even if they couldn't name it. The Medal of Honor. Awarded for a night in Kunar Province when Marcus had pulled 3 men from a burning building under direct fire, had taken a round through his left hand, had refused evacuation twice, and had not stopped moving until every one of his people was out or accounted for. He was heading to a funeral. Master Chief Petty Officer Raymond Cole, United States Navy SEAL, retired, had died of a stroke on a Tuesday, which Marcus had always thought was a particularly undignified day of the week for a man that large. Cole's daughter had called him at the Pentagon, and Marcus had stood in a hallway with the phone at his ear for a long moment after she hung up, waiting to find out what was still solid. He'd flown commercial to San Antonio, rented the car, driven 4 hours through flat and unforgiving scrubland without the radio on. He'd wanted the quiet. He'd been thinking about the cold Virginia wind and a class of 11 men standing in a row and Raymond Cole's hands, which had been steady the morning he pinned the trident to Marcus's chest at the end of Hell Week, and the thing Cole had said quietly that Marcus had carried for 22 years like a compass bearing. You earned it. Don't waste it. The trident pin was the thing Marcus kept returning to as he stood at the pump in the morning heat watching the numbers climb. Cole had pinned it on himself, the senior instructor choosing to do what he could have delegated, and he had looked Marcus in the eye in that cold wind without ceremony and said nothing else, which was how Cole always communicated the things that mattered most. The pin was not a decoration. It was a name. It said, "You are one of these men, and these men do not stop." The Medal of Honor he wore without performance because it represented not what he'd done, but what it had cost. The men he'd lost. That night in Kunar were still the first thing he saw when he closed his eyes in a quiet room, and the ribbon on his chest was to him less a tribute than a debt he intended to spend the rest of his life trying to earn. He had just capped the tank and turned toward the store to pay when the sound of gravel shifting under tires made him look up, not because he was startled, but because his body had been cataloging the sounds of that parking lot since the moment he'd arrived, and this one was new. The county cruiser rolled in slow lights off parking at an angle that blocked both exit lanes with the ease of long practice, and Marcus watched Deputy Colt Briggs step out into the morning sun, adjusting his sunglasses, hooking his thumbs in his belt, letting his gaze settle on the dress blues. The look lasted only a second, but in that second, Marcus saw what was in it. Not the skeptical squint of a man assessing a potential fraud, but something rawer and more honest. A flash of recognition that moved through Briggs's face and was gone so fast the deputy probably didn't know it had been there. It was the look of a man who had spent 19 years building something over a wound and who had just encountered the wound again. In the passenger seat, rookie Pete Nolan sat very still, his eyes moving between the uniform and Briggs's face, with the expression of someone who already knows this is going to go wrong and has not yet found the courage to say so. Briggs crossed the lot with the deliberate, heel-heavy walk of a man performing ownership, the stride that announces itself, that expects the space to acknowledge it, his utility belt creaking with each step, his whole bearing constructed to ensure that whoever he was approaching felt the approach as something being done to them. He stopped 2 feet from Marcus with his sunglasses still on in the morning light and looked the uniform up and down with a slow, exaggerated theatricality that was designed to communicate disbelief and communicated instead something more specific, the expression of a man who resents what he's looking at and intends to do something about it. "Mighty fancy costume you got on there," Briggs said, his voice carrying the practiced warmth of a man who has delivered this line enough times that it no longer costs him anything. "Halloween come early this year," Marcus responded, the way he responded to everything that deserved no elaboration, with the plain facts delivered in the register he used in briefing rooms, which was deep and unhurried and utterly without apology. "It's not a costume, Deputy. I'm a commander in the United States Navy. I'm heading to a funeral in Oak Haven." Briggs let out a short, sharp bark of laughter and glanced back at the cruiser where Nolan was watching through the windshield.
Then he turned back, circling Marcus the way you circle something you've already decided you own, stopping finally in his personal space, close enough that Marcus could smell stale tobacco and peppermint gum and the sour edge of a man who runs on processed food and unchecked certainty. Marcus did not step back. Briggs raised his hand toward the ribbons, not quickly, but with the leisurely confidence of a man reaching for something on a shelf in his own house. Marcus's hand moved first, and there was nothing dramatic about it. No wind-up or telegraphing. One moment, Briggs's arm was extending, and the next, Marcus's grip was around his wrist, not crushing, not twisting, simply there, immovable as structural steel, and Briggs stopped with a physical jolt, like a man who has walked into a wall he didn't see coming. The moment held. Briggs stared at his own wrist. The flash of confusion on his face cycled through several things, quickly landing on the one that lived closest to the surface, rage dressed as authority. "Do not touch the uniform," Marcus said. The words came out flat and absolute, the voice of a man who has not needed volume to be heard in 22 years, and he released the wrist. Briggs yanked his hand back. His face went dark red. His palm dropped instinctively to the grip of his service weapon threat or reflex. In this context, the distinction didn't matter. "You put your hands on a law enforcement officer," Briggs said, and his voice had climbed slightly, the easy drawl cracking at the edges. "I prevented you from disrespecting a federal uniform," Marcus said. "I have no quarrel with you, deputy. Let me pay for my gas and go." In the passenger seat of the cruiser, Pete Nolan had gone absolutely still. Briggs unclipped his radio and called it in loud enough for the people watching from the gas station window to hear every word stolen valor assault on an officer, his voice ringing across the hot concrete with the theatrical confidence of a man performing for an audience he has always assumed would applaud. Marcus offered his military ID. Briggs waved it away without looking at it. Marcus gave the name and direct line of his commanding officer at Naval Special Warfare Command. Briggs talked over him. Marcus offered 2 separate phone numbers that would resolve this in under 5 minutes. Briggs refused them both with the escalating dismissal of someone who understands on some level that the information would end the performance. In the 2 seconds Briggs turned to call dispatch, Marcus ran the calculation he had run 1,000 times in worse places than a West Texas parking lot. The deputy's draw was slow, his stance wide, disarm him in 3 seconds, neutralize Nolan before he'd cleared the door in 4. Both exits viable. 2 civilians at the store window. He placed his hands on the hot metal of the car hood instead because Raymond Cole was in a box in Oak Haven and Marcus Webb was going to that funeral as an officer with his honor intact, and that was the end of the calculation. The pat-down was conducted with unnecessary force, every contact a statement. The wallet flipped open, glanced at, and slid across the hood with a clatter that left a small scuff in the paint. The handcuffs went on tight. Not officer tight. Message tight, the metal biting into the skin with a practiced precision that had nothing to do with procedure. "You're going to regret this, deputy," Marcus said quietly, his cheek against the warm metal of the hood. There was no heat in it, no desperation, just the tone of a man making an accurate prediction about the near future. As Briggs walked him to the cruiser and pushed him into the back seat harder than the situation required, Marcus looked through the side window at the lot one last time. The tanker truck had moved. It was backed up now against the underground fill hatch at the far corner of the property, and 2 men in work clothes were moving around it with the focused clockwork efficiency of people operating on a schedule that had no margin in it. Not the loose conversational rhythm of a routine delivery, but the concentrated precision of people who had counted their minutes and intended to use everyone. One of them glanced at the cruiser as it pulled out.
Marcus held the look for a half-second through the glass, then closed his eyes and settled back against the cage, letting the information take its place alongside everything else he'd collected since pulling into this lot. In the front passenger seat, Nolan's eyes kept finding the rearview mirror, then looking away, and in his face was not Briggs's contempt, but something more uncomfortable, the expression of a young man beginning to understand what he has allowed himself to be a part of. Briggs drove the way certain men drive when they have a captive audience aggressively with deliberate hard braking at the last second, and turns taken faster than the road required, each one sending Marcus into the cage divider with a sharp impact that Briggs absorbed in his shoulders without turning around. It was a very old technique. Make the body uncomfortable, the mind follows. It worked on approximately everyone except people who had spent a week in SERE school learning exactly how it worked and why. And so Marcus sat perfectly still in the back and memorized things instead. Deputy Colt Briggs Badge, 214, Unit 7. Officer Pete Nolan. Badge 219. Time of arrest, 7:52. A.M. direction, northwest on County Road 9. Briggs, Nolan said, quietly staring at the windshield. That ribbon rack, that's a silver star up there. Shut it, Pete. And I think that's the Medal of Hon. I said shut it. Flat and final. Guy bought that at a surplus store. Stolen valor makes me sick. They want the respect without a single day of sacrifice. Makes me physically sick. Briggs said it with real feeling, the practiced disgust of a man repeating a story he's told himself so many times it has become indistinguishable from conviction. In the back seat, Marcus opened his eyes and looked at the passing scrubland and felt nothing about what was being said because it occupied a drawer in his mind labeled irrelevant. And he had learned a very long time ago not to open that drawer when there was work to do. The Harlan County Sheriff's Station was a squat brick building that smelled of mildew and floor cleaner, and the specific staleness of a place where the windows hadn't been opened since the previous administration, and the fluorescent lights buzzed with the inconsistency of fixtures several years overdue for replacement. Briggs brought Marcus through the back entrance with a hand on his collar that gathered the fabric of the dress jacket and crumpled it, and Marcus said evenly, "Watch the jacket," and Briggs said equally evenly, "I don't give a damn about the jacket." And that more than anything else told Marcus everything he needed to know about the man behind him. The booking sergeant, a heavy-set man named Doyle who was working through a sandwich with the detached expression of someone who had processed enough people through this room to have stopped seeing individuals, looked up. "What you got? Stolen valor," Briggs announced loud enough for the officers at the far desk. "Guy thinks he's a Navy SEAL." He said it with the satisfaction of a man presenting evidence of a personal theory he has been vindicated on. Doyle looked at the uniform without expression and went back to his sandwich. They took Marcus to the processing room tiled walls, one overhead bulb, old sweat, and industrial soap, and Briggs ordered the jacket off. Marcus removed it, carefully folding it as well as the confined space allowed. Briggs snatched it mid-fold and dropped it into a plastic evidence bin. Then Briggs found the trident. He picked the jacket back up and turned it over in his hands. Looking, Marcus could see for something specific. When his eyes found the gold trident pin above the breast pocket, they stayed there for a moment, and the expression that moved across his face was not contempt. It was something that lived beneath contempt, something rawer and older. The look of a 19-year-old boy in a Midland recruiting office, hearing a word he had never expected to hear applied to himself. He unclipped the pocketknife from his belt. "Don't," Marcus said. The word landed in the tiled room with a weight that made even Doyle pause mid-chew. Briggs looked at him, his jaw tight, his eyes carrying something bright and ugly. He worked the tip of the knife under the threading of the pin with slow, deliberate care, and Marcus understood in that moment that this wasn't vandalism. This was Briggs answering a question he'd been living with for 19 years. If I can take this from you, then it was never as real as you thought it was. If I can break this, then the thing that disqualified me was nothing. The trident hit the floor with a small, clear metallic sound that seemed to fill the room. "Oops," Briggs said, but his voice was flat. There was no pleasure in it, just the hollow sound of a man who has done the thing he wanted to do and found that it didn't fix what he thought it would. Marcus looked at the pin on the dirty floor. He thought about Raymond Cole's hands in a cold Virginia wind. He thought about 11 men standing in a row. The fury that moved through him was not the hot kind. It was the cold, organized kind that files itself away and waits. "Run my fingerprints," Marcus said very quietly. "Look up my name in the federal database. Call Naval Special Warfare Command. You have one chance to fix this before it becomes something that cannot be fixed." Briggs told Nolan to book him and put him in cell 3 and turned his back. Pete Nolan stood alone in the processing room. He looked at the trident pin on the floor. He crouched down and picked it up, turning it over in his palm. It was heavy and solid in the way that cheap metal simply cannot replicate, and the gold had a warmth and depth that belonged to something made to last. He set it gently on the counter rather than leaving it on the floor, and when he glanced at Marcus, he mouthed one word that cost him something to say. Marcus saw it. He didn't acknowledge it, but he filed it away in a different drawer. Cell 3 was 8 by 10 concrete with a metal bench, a broken air conditioning unit that made noise without producing cooling, and a temperature that sat somewhere between uncomfortable and punishing. Marcus sat with his spine straight and his hands folded and his eyes closed, and he did not pace and he did not shout, because both of those things were available to him and neither of them would change anything, and he had learned a very long time ago that the man who preserves himself in captivity is the man who still has something to spend when the door opens. He listened to the station. Briggs's laugh from the bullpen, loose and comfortable, the laugh of a man who has won something. The crackle of dispatch radio. The clang of shift change around noon. He cataloged it all and waited. When the door finally opened, it was Nolan standing in the frame looking pale. "Briggs went to dinner," he said quietly. "Sergeant says you can make your call now." Marcus stood. "Open it." Nolan unlocked the door and led him to a wall-mounted phone in the corridor. 5 minutes. Local calls only." Marcus picked up the receiver and dialed from memory, not a lawyer, not family, but a number that existed in his mind alongside a small set of other numbers reserved for situations with no other resolution. A direct line to the Special Operations Command watch floor at the Pentagon. 2 rings. Watch Officer Captain Hayes. "Hayes, this is Commander Marcus Webb. Authorization Sierra Foxtrot 779er Zulu. I am being held unlawfully at the Harlan County Sheriff's Station in West Texas. I have been assaulted and my trident was removed with a knife." A beat of silence. Rapid keyboard input. "Commander Webb, we have you, sir. Good Lord. Are you injured?" "Negative. The arresting officer is Deputy Colt Briggs, badge 214. I need this resolved." "Sir, do not say another word to them. I am escalating immediately, waking up Admiral Whitmore right now. We are coming to get you." Marcus hung up the phone and looked at Nolan, who had been standing close enough to hear every word, and whose face had gone the color of old concrete. "Who was that?" Nolan managed. Marcus walked back to his cell, sat on the metal bench, and closed his eyes. "That," he said, "was the United States government, and they are very unhappy." At approximately 8:30 that evening, while Marcus Webb sat in the concrete silence of Cell 3, Deputy Colt Briggs and Sheriff Dale Munford sat across from each other in a corner booth at Rosie's Diner on 4th Street, which had the best chicken fried steak in the county, and the additional advantage of being owned by a man who owed Munford 3 favors.
Briggs was in good spirits. "Tanker came in clean," Munford said, cutting his steak without looking up. "2 hours after you left. No complications." "Told you," Briggs said. "Once I got the Fed off the lot, the whole thing ran smooth." He took a long pull of his sweet tea. "Should have seen his face when I popped that pin off. Thought he was going to have a stroke." He laughed, not the hollow sound from the processing room, but something more alive, the laugh of a man who has talked himself back into believing he won. "You should have seen his face," Munford chewed. "You ran his prints." Briggs waved a hand. "Machine was acting up. I'll do it before arraignment in the morning. Give the judge a laugh."
Munford was quiet for a moment, looking at something past Briggs's shoulder, and then he nodded slowly in the way of a man who has operated without consequence for so long that caution has stopped feeling necessary. "Fine. Get it done first thing." He picked up his coffee. "We've got another run Thursday. I need you sharp." "Always am," Briggs said, and leaned back in the booth with the comfortable expansiveness of a man who owns the room he's sitting in, which in this town he effectively did. In cell 3, 11 miles away, the broken AC unit rattled against the silence. At 7:45 the next morning, Briggs arrived at the station carrying a large iced coffee moving through the front door, with the wide, unhurried ease of a man who slept well and expects the day ahead to be uncomplicated. "Got a good one in holding," he told Doyle, dropping into his chair. "Lunatic in a Navy costume. Arraignment this morning ought to give the judge something to laugh about before lunch." Sheriff Munford arrived at 8, filling the doorway the way large men do who have held power long enough that the architecture seems arranged for them, nodding at the desk officers carrying his coffee and a paper bag from the diner. When they went back together to collect Marcus for arraignment, Briggs pushed open the door to cell 3, expecting to find him on the bench slumped, diminished the way people look after a night in that heat. Marcus was doing one-armed push-ups. The reps were rhythmic and precise, and completely unhurried, each one identical to the last, his body moving like a mechanism running a program, not a trace of exertion on his face despite the heat and the hours. He heard the door and stood in a single fluid movement, clasping his hands behind his back, his spine straight, the posture of a man in complete command of the room he is locked inside. Munford looked at him, at the posture, at the eyes, at the physical fitness that was functional rather than decorative. A cold seed of something planted itself in his gut. "Your name," Munford said. "Commander Marcus Webb, United States Navy." Munford turned to Briggs. "Run his prints. Now." The fingerprint scanner beeped processed, and then the screen flashed red, a warning dialogue in stark black text on white that Briggs had to read twice before his brain accepted that he was reading it correctly. "Warning, classified, identity level 5 clearance. Do not detain. Contact Department of Defense immediately." At that exact moment, the red phone on Munford's desk began to ring. Not the public line, not the dispatch line. The emergency line connecting directly to state police and federal agencies that had sat in the corner of Munford's office for the duration of his tenure without making a sound. Everyone in the booking area looked at it. Marcus tilted his head slightly. "You should answer that, Sheriff." Munford crossed the room and picked it up with a hand that was not quite steady, and brought it to his ear, and said in the measured voice of a man trying to sound more certain than he feels, "Sheriff Munford. Sheriff Munford." The voice that came back was female-controlled and carried the particular weight of someone who has not raised her voice in a professional setting in years because she has not needed to. "This is Admiral Grace Whitmore, Chief of Naval Operations. I understand you are currently holding Commander Marcus Webb in your facility." "Admiral, there was a situation at a local..." "Sheriff, I'm going to tell you 3 things. Not a pause. A precision cut. Commander Webb is a decorated Navy SEAL with 22 years of active service. He is a recipient of the Medal of Honor, and he is being held unlawfully in your building. Those are facts, not allegations. Admiral, if I could just explain the circumstances, you have 5 minutes after this call ends to release him and return every piece of his property in the condition it was in when he arrived at your station. The Admiral's voice dropped, and somehow dropping made it worse. My sources tell me his uniform was physically desecrated during processing. Sheriff, I want you to understand something not as a threat, but as a professional statement of intent. If there is a mark on that man that your deputy put there, the United States Navy will not be merciful. Not to you, not to your department, not to anyone in that building who watched it happen and said nothing. The line went dead. Munford set the phone down with the careful deliberation of a man placing something fragile on a surface. He turned and looked at Briggs, and his face had gone the color of old ash. "Unlock him," Munford said. It was barely above a whisper. "What?" Briggs hadn't fully processed it yet. The iced coffee was still in his hand. "Unlock him." The whisper didn't get louder. It got harder the way cold gets harder. Briggs removed the handcuffs with hands that had lost their certainty. The keys fumbling once before finding the lock, and Marcus rubbed his wrists and looked at Munford with the same expression he'd worn since the pump-watchful patient giving nothing away. "It was a misunderstanding," Munford said. "A mistake. Charges are dropped. You're free to go, Commander." "The charges against me are dropped," Marcus said. "That's correct. But the crimes committed in this building over the last 18 hours are just beginning to come to light." Munford's posture stiffened. "We made a mistake. You walk out, we forget it happened. Don't push your luck." Marcus walked to the front window and looked out at the parking lot. "I can't do that, Sheriff." "Why not?" Marcus pointed. The parking lot of the Harlan County Sheriff's Department had acquired in the time since Munford's phone call 4 black SUVs with government plates, 2 military police trucks in matte gray, and above the high school football field across the street, descending with the deep rhythmic authority that people who have heard it never forget, a Black Hawk helicopter in dark gray that made the station's windows vibrate in their frames as it settled onto the grass. Briggs's iced coffee hit the floor. "They're already here," Marcus said. The front doors of the Harlan County Sheriff's Station opened the way they open when the people coming through them have spent careers going through doors that people did not want, opened, not kicked, not forced, simply entered with the quiet authority of individuals who understand that presence correctly deployed is usually sufficient. 2 military police officers in full tactical gear came through, first their hands near their holsters without touching them, their eyes running a rapid professional assessment of the room's geometry and occupants that registered everything in approximately 3 seconds. Behind them, 2 agents in dark suits, and behind the agents, Lieutenant Commander David Reeves of the Judge Advocate General's Corps, tall silver at the temples carrying a leather portfolio with the ease of someone who knows exactly what is in it and exactly what it does. Reeves scanned the room. Booking desk, Munford Briggs, and then his eyes found Marcus Webb standing by the window holding the crumpled dress jacket, and something shifted briefly in the professional detachment of his bearing, giving way to something more personal. He stopped. His heels came together. He rendered a sharp, precise salute. "Commander Webb, sir," Reeves said, his voice carrying across the room with a clarity that left nothing ambiguous about where the authority in this building now resided. "Lieutenant Commander Reeves, JAG Corps, I am here to relieve you of this situation." Marcus returned it slowly. "At ease, David. You took your time." "Traffic was murder, sir." 1 beat of deadpan. And then Reeves turned to face Munford, and the brief warmth in his expression disappeared entirely, replaced by something as welcoming as a federal indictment. Reeves opened the portfolio and placed a document on the booking desk with a small final sound. A federal warrant from the Western District of Texas authorizing Marcus's immediate release, the custody of his effects, the seizure of his rental vehicle, and the securing of all physical and digital evidence related to his detention. Munford tried the jurisdiction argument. Reeves set a second document beside the first. Special Agent Carol Hines, who had been standing quietly to Reeves's left, stepped forward and explained in the level cadence of someone reciting established law to someone about to have a very bad day. The handling of Marcus's personal effects by Briggs and the impounding of his vehicle created a federal jurisdictional bridge that gave the government access to every piece of evidence in this building, digital, physical, and otherwise, right down to the footage on every camera the department operated. "Including the dash cam on Unit 7, Hines said, looking at Briggs. The effect was immediate. Briggs took a half step toward the door to the back offices, and the two MPs moved before he'd completed it in under 3 seconds. Deputy Colt Briggs was pinned against the wall beside the booking desk, with his arm wrenched behind his back and his cheek against the cinder block. The angle of the hold, the pressure on the shoulder, the leg position it was in, its specifics essentially identical to the position in which Briggs had placed Marcus Webb at pump number 4. Reeves noted this aloud in the same dispassionate tone he might use to describe weather. "Resisting federal agents. We'll add it to the list." Munford watched his deputy get pinned to the wall, and he understood with the particular clarity that comes when something you have been avoiding finally arrives that the walls were not closing. They had already closed. Marcus, dressed in the station locker room in fresh Navy utilities brought by the team folding the crumpled dress blues into a garment bag with careful hands. Then he walked back into the bullpen and crossed to where Briggs was held against the wall, and he leaned in close enough that only Briggs could hear him. His voice was very quiet, almost gentle. "When you patted me down at the pump," Marcus said, "you asked if I had any weapons. I told you no. That was the truth." He straightened. "But I never said I didn't have an army." He turned to Reeves. "Lock it down, David. Nobody leaves." Outside along the sidewalk and into the street, the people of Harlan County had gathered, phones raised, filming the black SUVs and the military trucks and the federal agents carrying boxes to government vehicles. Among them were people who had received Briggs's exit interview over the years. People who had been run out of town, locked up, shaken down, silenced. Not one of them was saying anything. The silence of people watching justice arrive is its own kind of statement. Briggs was led out through the front doors in handcuffs, and the crowd did not cheer and did not shout and did not do anything at all except watch, which was, in its way, far worse. Agent Hines walked into the converted briefing room carrying a tablet, set it on the table in front of Marcus and Reeves, and pressed play without preamble. "He tried to remote delete it about 12 minutes before we came through the door," she said. "Not sophisticated enough to know about the cloud backup." The footage was from inside Briggs's cruiser, the audio captured by the interior microphone, with the flat, unforgiving clarity of a recording that knows nothing about discretion. The timestamp read 7:39 a.m. In the footage, Briggs was driving slowly down State Route 9 with his personal cell phone held low against the steering wheel. "It's me. I'm coming up on 9. Where's the tanker?" A voice on the other end, slightly distorted but audible, said something about a late departure from the south. 30 minutes out. Hold the lot." "Copy. I'll do a pass." The cruiser rolled slowly past the entrance to Buckhorn Gas and Feed. Through the windshield, visible at pump number 4, a man in navy dress blues, standing at a silver rental car. Briggs's voice changed, not dramatically, but in the way voices change when a calculation is running underneath them, the casual giving way to something operational. "Boss, we've got a problem. Federal uniform at the pumps, Navy, Dress blues looks high brass, standing right there. The voice on the other end quiet. Is he looking at the tanker area? Not yet, but the tanker's rolling right past him when it comes in. Then get him off the lot. I don't care what you use. Stolen valor, disorderly, anything, just get a uniform out of that parking lot before the delivery gets there. You've got 20 minutes. A pause. Then Briggs casual and certain. Easy. I'll handle it. The footage ended. The room was quiet. So it wasn't just arrogance, Marcus said without looking up from the tablet. He was clearing the zone. Yes, sir, Hines said. Hines swiped to a thermal satellite image of Buckhorn gas and feed the underground tank layout rendered in false color and explained without inflection what the scan had found. Tanks 1 and 2 standard gasoline consistent with the facility's registered capacity. Tank 3 registered as inactive and awaiting decommissioning, not empty. The heat signatures showed stacked rectangular objects, crates, consistent with compressed fentanyl packaging moving north in commercial quantities. The tanker had made partial contact with the fill hatch before the convoy's approach caused the drivers to abort. The truck had been intercepted on Route 9 40 minutes later. Its contents were currently being cataloged by a DEA field team 12 miles east. Street value just over $2 million. Briggs has been running this lot as a surveillance post for at least 3 years, Hines said. Anyone who came through and seemed like they might be federal Briggs handled them. Exit interview. Marcus looked at the thermal image for a long moment. Who's on the other end of that call? The burner number was a dead end on identification purchased in cash used exclusively for these calls, last pinged 2 hours ago. Standard. Except. The phone that received Briggs's call, Hines said, pulling up a second screen, pinged off the cell tower on the roof of this building at 7:39 a.m. The signal radius covers 400 meters. This tower covers one building. She looked through the glass partition toward the sheriff's private office, where Dale Munford sat with his head in his hands. One building. Marcus looked through the glass at the man who had run this county for a decade. We need a voice confirmation, Reeves said. A good defense attorney will argue audio distortion, phone compression. We need a human witness who was physically present for that call. We have one, Marcus said. Nolan was in that car. Hines glanced at her notes. He watched it happen. That makes him complicit. He picked up my trident pin off the floor, Marcus said, and he put it on the counter instead of leaving it in the dirt. He knew what it was. He knew what it meant. He looked at Hines. He's not rotten. He's scared. There's a difference. Bring him in. Pete Nolan sat in the interrogation room without handcuffs, which in some ways made it harder. The absence of restraints left him with nothing to look at and nothing to push against. Nothing to tell himself except that he was here because he had made choices and choices had consequences. And here the consequence was sitting in a gray room knowing that a man he'd watched get humiliated the day before was on the other side of that door. He was 24 years old, and he looked in this moment closer to 17. The paper cup of water in his hands trembled with a fine, continuous tremor he couldn't suppress. Marcus entered alone and sat across from him, and the silence lasted exactly as long as it needed to before Nolan broke it. I didn't know the full picture, sir, Nolan said, his voice cracking on the last word. When I started, nobody told me anything directly. They just said, follow Briggs, do what you're told, keep your head down. The county takes care of its own. He looked at the table. I knew the tanker wasn't normal. I knew the phone calls weren't standard. I knew what the exit interviews were. A long pause. I told myself it wasn't my business, that I was new, that I didn't have enough information to know what was really... He stopped. His jaw tightened. I'm telling myself a story, aren't I? Yes,
Marcus said, without judgment. The voice on that phone yesterday morning, Marcus said. You heard it? You know whose it was. Nolan looked at the table. Officer Nolan. Marcus leaned forward slightly. I'm going to tell you what the next 10 years of your life look like.
You stay quiet. You take the conspiracy charge. You're 24 years old, going into a federal facility, and 34 years old coming out, and the person you might have been is gone. That's one version of your life. Nolan's jaw was working. Or, Marcus said, you tell me what you heard in that cruiser yesterday morning. You tell it on record. And you walk out of this building today with something still intact. Nolan looked up. His eyes were wet. When he spoke, the words came out steadily, despite everything, with the particular clarity of someone who has been carrying a weight for a long time and has finally decided to set it down. It was Munford, he said. Sheriff Munford. I'd know that voice anywhere. I've been hearing it in my ear since my first week on the job. He put the paper cup down. I've got dates. Things I wrote down in a notebook because I was scared and I thought someday I might need them. Tanker schedules, the names of people Briggs ran out of town. Phone call times going back 8 months, he exhaled. I'll give you everything. Marcus stood. He paused beside Nolan's chair on his way to the door and rested a hand briefly on the younger man's shoulder just a moment, and then walked out. Marcus did not knock. He opened the door to Munford's office with the easy authority of a man who has stopped asking permission from people who no longer have anything to grant or withhold, and he stepped inside and stood in front of the desk, and Munford looked up from behind a cup of coffee that had been cold for an hour, and a face that had shed in the span of one morning everything it had spent 30 years accumulating. The badge on his chest, the football trophies on the shelf, the framed newspaper clipping above the filing cabinet Harlan County's own Dale Munford elected sheriff by record margin, all of it still physically present, none of it meaning anything anymore. This is still my office, Munford said, and heard even as he said it that it wasn't. Marcus set the tablet on the desk screen facing him and let him read. Nolan's testimony, the cell tower data, the dashcam transcript, the thermal scan, the intercepted tanker manifest. 8 months of scheduling records written in a careful hand in a notebook that had been sitting in a second-floor apartment on Caldwell Street kept by a 24-year-old who had been frightened enough to document everything and decent enough to hand it over when it mattered. Munford read it all. The color drained from his face in stages the way a landscape loses light near the end of a day, not all at once, but incrementally until what remained was not a powerful man in his prime, but someone older and smaller, a man looking at the thing he'd built and understanding for the first time what it actually was. The town was dying, Munford said, barely audible. People needed the county needed something. There was no money coming in, no jobs, no future. I did what I had to. You didn't save this county, Marcus said. You sold it. You sold poison to the people who trusted you with a badge and called it economic necessity. He looked at Munford steadily. And when a soldier came through on his way to bury a hero, you used that same badge to try and destroy him because he was standing in your way. Not out of necessity, out of reflex, because power like yours can't tolerate witnesses. Munford said nothing. Agent Hines and her team came through the door, and Munford did not resist. He stood, turned, let the handcuffs go on without a word. He looked at Marcus once, just before Hines walked him out, and what lived in his face in that moment was not defiance. It was shame. The particular irreversible shame of a man who has finally seen himself clearly. Marcus did not return the look. He walked out into the bullpen and through the front windows in the hard morning sun. Harlan County watched its sheriff come out in chains. The federal courthouse in Houston occupied a full city block and had the particular gravity of a building that takes its function seriously. Tall, stone-faced, the federal seal above the entrance, the feel of a place where consequences are not rhetorical but structural, built into every corridor and courtroom. The trial of United States versus Munford and Briggs had been national news since the photograph went viral, taken by a woman watching from the Buckhorn gas and feed store window. It showed a black man in a Medal of Honor uniform, with his hands pressed to a car hood, while a white deputy stood behind him grinning, and it moved across the country with the force of an image that names something people have been struggling to articulate. In the gallery, Commander Marcus Webb sat in his full dress blues. The restored trident pin gleamed on his chest. The needle straightened the small scratch in the gold still visible if you looked for it. At the defense table, Briggs and Munford were unrecognizable orange jumpsuits, 30 years of confident authority stripped completely away. Briggs had lost 20 pounds. Munford stared at the table. Gerald Marsh was the best money could buy in the state of Texas. Lean, precise Italian suit, cold smile, the kind of man who had walked into significantly more difficult courtrooms than this one and walked out with verdicts that left galleries speechless. His approach to Marcus on cross-examination was patient and methodical and built slowly the PTSD angle, the battlefield trauma hypothesis. The portrait of an unstable veteran who had escalated a routine encounter because authority was a trigger and the uniform was a trigger, and he had been operating from a compromised position since Kunar Province. It was exactly the wrong tactic to deploy against Marcus Webb. Marcus sat in the witness box and listened to the full construction of Marsh's argument with the patience of a man who has spent 2 decades waiting in situations that required it. And when it was complete, he addressed it with the simple, measured authority of someone who has earned the right to say what he means without raising his voice. He said for the record that he had held his fire with a loaded weapon in situations that would have made Marsh's worst professional day look unremarkable. That the decision not to harm Briggs at that pump was not a failure of restraint, but an exercise of it. And that the difference between a soldier and a bully is not a question of capability. Both can hurt people, but of the deliberate, conscious daily choice about when not to. Marsh had no effective follow-up. He had handed the jury a definition and a living demonstration, and the jury was paying close attention. Marsh's final move was a motion to suppress the dashcam footage obtained. He argued before a warrant was fully executed. The drug charges built on it, therefore, collapsible. The judge, a black woman with 30 years on the bench and the expression of someone who has run out of patience for arguments deployed in bad faith, was considering it. Then the back doors of the courtroom opened. The man who came through them was 71 years old, using a wooden cane, wearing a suit that had been expensive in a previous decade, carrying a battered leather briefcase, and moving with the careful dignity of someone who has been frightened for a very long time and has today decided to stop. His name was Albert Garza Pop to everyone who knew him, and he had owned Buckhorn Gas and Feed for 34 years before Dale Munford had made him an offer he couldn't refuse. When Pop had tried to document what was happening on his property, Munford had told him with absolute quiet certainty that if Pop ever spoke to anyone about it, his grandson would not be safe. Pop had believed him. Right up until he saw the photograph. A man in a Medal of Honor uniform, hands on a car hood, a deputy grinning behind him, and something in Pop that had been dormant for 3 years shifted not gradually, but with the irreversibility of something structural giving way, and he packed the briefcase and drove to Houston. The briefcase held a ledger and 11 audio recordings from a device hidden in the back office of Buckhorn Gas and Feed. Among them, Dale Munford's voice, clear and unhurried, authorizing the death of a state trooper who had gotten too close. The courtroom erupted. Marsh sat down. The motion to suppress became irrelevant, the way a single dropped match becomes irrelevant when the building is already burning. Munford stared at the wall. Briggs put his head on the defense table. Pop looked across the courtroom at Marcus, his eyes full, and Marcus gave him one slow nod, the kind that means you came back. That's enough. That's everything. Pop lifted one weathered hand in something that was almost a salute, and Marcus held the nod until the old man lowered his hand. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. Guilty on all counts: racketeering, drug trafficking, conspiracy to commit murder assault on a federal officer, deprivation of rights under color of law. The judge addressed each man with the gravity of someone who does not enjoy this part of the work, but understands with complete clarity its necessity. Briggs, 30 years for racketeering and trafficking, 28 consecutive for assault on a federal officer and civil rights violations, 58 years total, eligible for parole at 96. Munford life without the possibility of parole for racketeering, conspiracy, and ordering the murder of a peace officer. As the bailiffs prepared to lead them out, Reeves leaned past the defense table and informed Marsh of the transfer arrangements. Given both defendants' law enforcement backgrounds, the Bureau of Prisons had designated standard federal facilities as presenting unacceptable safety risks. They would be sent to the military disciplinary barracks at Fort Leavenworth, the administrative unit for civilians who had committed crimes against the United States military, staffed entirely by military, police, Marine Corps corrections officers, and Army personnel. Briggs heard this. He turned toward Marcus at the railing. Marcus looked at him, and there was nothing in his face that could be called triumph or satisfaction. Just the clear, even accounting of a man closing a ledger on something that needed to be closed. "It's a hard facility, Deputy," Marcus said quietly enough that only Briggs could hear it. "The guards wear the uniform you decided meant nothing. Every day. For 58 years. Briggs's legs gave way on the way to the door. The bailiffs held him up. The heavy oak doors closed behind him with a sound like a period at the end of a very long sentence. A week after the sentencing, the heat wave that had gripped West Texas for 3 months finally broke, and the morning Marcus drove to Oak Hill Veterans Cemetery was cool and clean, the sky a pale, washed-out blue, the air carrying mesquite and distance, the kind of morning that feels like something has been rinsed away. He had the cemetery to himself. He walked the path from the map Cole's daughter had sent him, past the older stones, past the rows of white marble standing in the ordered, patient alignment that military cemeteries use to say something about the people inside them. And he found what he was looking for at the end of the 3rd row from the fence. A fresh headstone, still bright white, against the older grays around it. Master Chief Petty Officer Raymond Cole, United States Navy SEAL. The only easy day was yesterday. Marcus stood before it for a long time without moving. He reached into the breast pocket of his dress blues and took out the trident pin. The same one Briggs had pried off with a pocket knife onto a dirty floor. The same one Nolan had picked up and placed on the counter rather than leave in the dirt. He had straightened the needle with a pair of pliers in a Houston hotel room the night before the trial. But the small scratch where the blade had caught the gold was still there, a fine, thin line that caught the light when the angle was right. He had decided without articulating exactly why not to have it repaired. He knelt and pressed the pin into the soft earth at the base of the headstone, and it went in cleanly, the needle holding firm. "Sorry I was late, Chief," he said, and his voice was quiet and steady and entirely private, the voice of a man in a conversation that has been waiting a long time to happen. "Ran into some trouble on the road. But I handled it. The way you taught me, I didn't swing until I had the whole picture. I didn't waste the shot, and I didn't leave until the job was done." He stood, brushed the earth from his knees, adjusted his cover. He held the salute for 3 full seconds longer than regulation required, and then he turned and walked back to his car without looking back because the war was over and the uniform was clean and justice, though it had taken the long road, had finally arrived. Colt Briggs was processed into Fort Leavenworth on a Tuesday in November, and the guard who opened the door to his unit was a young black Marine in a pressed uniform posture, perfect eyes forward, the quiet authority of someone doing his job without needing anyone to notice. And Briggs looked at him for one long second and then looked at the floor and did not look up again for a very long time. Pete Nolan completed his probation without incident and enrolled the following spring in a paralegal program at a community college in San Antonio, where he showed up every morning with the quiet seriousness of a person who has decided the best thing he can do with what he now knows about the world is to make himself useful in it. He never wore a badge again. He didn't need to. The trident pin stayed in the earth at Raymond Cole's grave through the last of summer and the thin Texas autumn and a brief pale winter, and visitors who walked that path sometimes stopped when the light caught it a small gold point against the white marble and stood for a moment wondering about it without ever quite knowing the story of the man who had left it there, or the long and costly road that had brought him finally home. If this story moved something in you, if you've ever watched someone abuse the power they were given to protect and felt that particular helpless fury of knowing it was wrong and not being able to stop it, then you already understand why justice, when it finally arrives, matters so much. It doesn't always come fast. It doesn't always come easy. But it comes. If you believe that, hit like and subscribe to our channel and leave a comment below. We read every single one.